Welcome to our podcast series titled YPA Shift Podcast. We'll be delving into culture, religion, and SRHR in Bhutan. For a country that's very culturally rich, well, there's a lot to unpack when we bring up the topic of SRHR. I have with me here Ms. Chimil Hamo, who has been an active volunteer for YPA Bhutan for I was about to say the last few decades, but the last few years. And right now she is an educator, a teacher. Welcome, Chimi. But before we actually go into the podcast to talk about the topic, I'd like you to tell our listeners here, who are you?
My name is Chimil Hamo. I'm 21 years old. I graduated college from RTC last year. And I have been an active member of YPR since the year 2020, which was when I joined college. So throughout my years at RTC and even after, I guess you could say I've been everywhere. I've been to different events, I have seen things, I have experienced things, and I've cultivated some knowledge. And although I may not be the expert on what we're going to talk about today, I would love to share my experiences with you all.
She is an expert. She's just being demure.
Very demure.
So yeah, let's get into it then. First up, let's talk about the Buddhist culture, right? Bhutan is considered the last Shangri-La. We're known for our culture, tradition, and currently Bhutan, well, from what I heard, people say, Bhutan has this very unique blend of modernity and tradition, right? Yeah. And that kind of define our whole culture at this point. So now I'd like to ask you, how does culture, impact how Buddhist people think about SRHR, think about family planning, think about, contraception?
So this is something that's been talked about in almost every event we hold at YPR, during the trainings, during the meet. So we all know how Bhutan is deeply rooted in culture and traditions. We hold our values in high regard. And with that, it's good for us, of course. As someone growing up in this time, right, you tend to forget the importance of culture, but then as you grow up, as you stay, as you experience, you start to appreciate Bhutan's culture. But then again, it has an effect on the way people think, and that could be a problem. So first of all, SRHR, Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights. The moment I tell people the full form of SRHR, I've experienced this, people start getting uncomfortable. So why are you talking about sex? Why is there a whole organization based on that, right? So it's mainly the way people think, because Bhutan's culture comes mainly from our religion that we are so devoted in, from Buddhism. And although there is no Buddhist text that says that sex is a sin or you shouldn't be talking about it, because of the way people have upheld these values, people have been very devoted and disciplined, right? Because of that, I feel like we've somehow restricted our minds into believing that talking about your sexual and reproductive health is a taboo. And I think that's something all of us know. So because of that, it makes conversations very uncomfortable. So as youth, we're not trying to just empower and educate the youth, right? We also want to look into older audiences. But that is very difficult for us to do so because of that awkwardness, that uncomfortable atmosphere we have when we start talking about it. So.
Well, since you brought up the topic of religion, most of the Buddhist culture, like you said, we're deeply rooted in our cultures. And if you go through all of the history books, pretty sure religion has played a huge role, more especially Buddhism. You already said it, but could you maybe elaborate more on how religion kind of impacts, the Buddhist population, like how they think about SRHR,
I don't think it's religion itself that will shape the mindset of people. It's more of the cultural practices that come with religion. So for example, in Buddhism, we basically the whole philosophy of Buddhism is to be a good human being, to be compassionate, right? To let go of your desires. But we also have a lot of discipline, a lot of rules that come with being a Buddhist, like having to wake up early in the morning, chip, right? Then there's also taking off your shoes before entering al-hakang, and I think those are really good practices. Those are amazing practices to be a disciplined person, to be healthy in your body, mind, and spirit. But at the same time, things like that turn into cultural practices that get passed on over time. And that's what I feel like restricts people's mindsets, because they're so devoted to doing that, to being that disciplined person, right? That they tend to not open their minds to other things. So, for example, speaking from my experience, last year, I think in December, a group of Waipirians, we went to Bumthang for a retreat, for a religious retreat with the Homon Society, who were very kind enough to take us there. And we learned a lot of things, because in Waipir, we're always talking about being culturally sensitive, but at the same time promoting SRHR, educating people, changing mindsets. But we were not really sure how to do that, right? And honestly, I'm still not very sure. I don't have the right answer yet. But one interesting thing that happened there was we were lucky enough to get an audience with a religious figure. He spoke to us like we were friends, like in a very casual manner, and made it comfortable for us to ask questions. So one of the Waipirians from that group talked about the topic that we all like to question, women not being allowed in Genkangs, right? You never hear the end of it. But what we found out was that there is no text in Buddhism, in any of Buddha's teachings, that say that women should not be allowed in the Genkang of Al-Hakang, right? So what happened was, this is a cultural practice, and people, because of the respect they have, because of the devotion they have, it turns into a rule that's followed very religiously, right? So women not being allowed in the Genkang is not something that's going to affect their lives or make a big impact, right? But then it's like the butterfly effect. Little things turn into that mindset that we have today, that traditional mindset where women are seen as inferior, or we shouldn't be allowed to talk about sex and reproductive health. So at least that's what I think from what I've experienced.
That makes sense to me. I agree with all of your statement, and I also believe, like, I consider myself agnostic, right? But I still believe in the whole philosophy of Buddhism. And then I feel like at this point, there's like, if you took like a Venn diagram of culture and religion, there's only some things that kind of intersects. But culture and religion are supposed to be like two different things. But the thing is, we have the tendency to make everything religious at this point, right? The whole conversation now sounds like culture and religion more. Basically, it's the driver for how people think and all that, right? And then you were part of YPA Shift campaign last year as well. And then you know that we deal with a lot of younger generation, right? But now, like you said, because Bhutan is deeply rooted in its culture, I think it's important that we be like culturally sensitive at the same time, right?
Yes.
There are some things that we need to be sensitive about. So from your opinion, how do we stay culturally sensitive while we talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights to younger generation?
I mentioned in the other answer, I still don't know the right answer yet, but one thing I learned from that retreat was that I think all we have to do is have a lot of conversations. We, as Waipirians, we were talking about SRHR, but we were trying to keep it very PG-13. We were using other words. We were saying well-being. We were saying health. So I feel like that's one way we could have conversations like that, because like I said, it gets really uncomfortable, right? So I feel like we could use different terms, make it wholesome, because SRHR is very wholesome if you think about it. You're not only talking about your reproductive health, you're talking about your rights, human rights, mental health, all of that. And that, actually, remember you talked about the Venn diagram? Now, if I put a Venn diagram with SRHR and the values of religion, I feel like there'd be a lot more similarities than there are differences. And instead of having debates, we could both share knowledge, because that was, like I said, what was happening. It can lead to a greater understanding.
Thank you, Chimi. Now it sounds like you're coming down to education more, right? Which is like a huge part of what YPR does. We create awareness, we educate, but we entertain at the same time. Now we have the tech-savvy younger generations right now. Then we have the traditional people, right? Now how do we connect them? How do we bring them together and be like, oh, it's okay to talk about your SRHR?
Back when I was younger, maybe in high school, I had a lot of anger towards traditional mindsets and the older generation thinking, oh, why can't they understand? It's for everyone's well-being, it's for everyone's good. Why can't they open their minds, right? But then I realized that they have very good reasons to be like that. Like, it was taught to them, it was their entire life. You can't just change your values and your mindset overnight. But at the same time, I feel like the younger generation can be a lot less rigid as well. The same way we expect the older generation to be less rigid. So when we talk about education, but I think the best thing we can do is to have conversations where you're not being defensive. Understanding the roots of and the cause of everything that we are debating about could lead to us getting a mutual understanding. So that's what I think, but bringing them all together, I'm not sure if that's something I can answer.
So from your perspective, right? You're a young adult. You're working now. Recently graduated college. You've been advocating and creating awareness for SRHR for a very long time. From your perspective, again, now what do you think the future holds, for SRHR in Bhutan?
I feel like Bhutan is doing really well in terms of its progress towards opening everyone's minds towards SRHR and topics that were basically difficult to talk about before. Because first of all, I feel like a lot of people are gravitating towards SRHR. It's not just YPR. YPR is doing most of it, I believe, but I feel like other organizations are also trying to make efforts to do what we're doing, basically, but in their own way, without the peer-to-peer approach. I see a lot of more open minds. I see a lot of healthy discussions instead of annoying debates on the internet over Facebook comments. This is not something that changes overnight. We know that culture doesn't change overnight, and it shouldn't, honestly. Culture is a great thing. It's amazing. It's what makes us who we are, right? But I think it's important to address issues that also come with being very rigid with our culture. This might be a very sensitive topic, but there are a lot of sexual assault cases these days. And I feel like this was probably happening a long time ago as well. But people are reporting. They know that what's being done to them is wrong. Even though it's terrible to hear news like this, I'm at least glad that people are reporting it now and that people are aware that what happened to them is wrong and that the perpetrator should be punished and all of that. So I feel like the future seems bright, actually. And I feel like if YPR continues what they're doing while being culturally sensitive, like I said, having conversations, at least clearing out our doubts before we start attacking or being defensive and all of that. So as long as we're doing that, I feel like maybe culture might not change, but at least people's mindsets are going to change. People are going to be more open.
Well, hopefully in the future that number would decrease, not because they don't report it, but because there's less cases, right? So now it makes sense to me. Oh, thank you for that. And then you have shared a lot of things with us today. And I'm pretty sure the listeners here, they'll be walking out with fresh perspective on SRHR, hopefully, yeah. But before we end the podcast, is there anything that you'd like to share with the listener?
So I've yapped, I've blabbered a lot, but at the end of the day, I think what I really want to say through this conversation is that as young people, we should have very open minds, and that doesn't mean just being open to talking about SRHR. It also means being open to understand the older generation, being open to understand the cultural and religious norms that we have, because they're all there for a reason, and they're good for us, they're good for the country, they're good for everything we stand for. It's just important for all of us to talk about things that have to be talked about, like SRHR, human rights, all of that, but while being culturally sensitive, right? While keeping our cultural values in mind. So don't criticize anything. Don't get defensive. Have conversations with people. Have conversations with older people, with people who know more than us about culture and religion, right? So I think, yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for having me here. Even after a whole year, YPR is very important to me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you back, Chami. So that is the end of our very first episode. I'd like to first of all thank you, all the listeners, for tuning in. And then make sure to stay connected to YPR Bhutan's Facebook page. We'll be posting this in our YouTube and SoundCloud as well. And I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Baldwin, and I'm checking out now. Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Save the children.